Now, Alex Salmond has held informal talks with the European Free Trade Association about Scotland's future relationship with Europe. It's understood the former First Minister recently travelled to EFTA's headquarters in Switzerland. And that's where our political correspondent Glenn Campbell is tonight.
Well, it's one thing discussing a special deal for Scotland, quite another to actually deliver one. And to be clear, right now it is not possible for Scotland to join the European Free Trade Association because, as Norway's Trade Minister made very clear, the current rules would prevent that from happening because you have to be an independent country to be in this particular trade club. But might the rules be changed if the UK government was to make a special request? Well, Iceland's Foreign Minister, the current chair of EFTA, was more open-minded about that. She also said on behalf of Iceland that she would welcome an application for membership from the UK as a whole. Now, if that was to happen, I think Nicola Sturgeon would see that as a win. If not, if the UK were to help make it possible for Scotland to get a special deal and transfer the extra powers to Holyrood that would be required alongside that, Nicola Sturgeon would consider that a win. If neither of those things happen, she hasn't necessarily lost, because in those circumstances she might well argue that the only way to go is to have another referendum on independence. No guarantees she'd win that, and her political opponents in the Scottish Conservatives say she should drop all that talk, that talk of membership of EFTA is pointless, and that the focus should be on trying to get the best possible UK-wide deal.
Glenn Campbell in Switzerland. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to Dr. Kirsty Hughes, who's an Associate Fellow of the think tank Friends of Europe. I began by asking her whether there's really any chance of a special deal for Scotland.
I don't think it's pointless. I think exploring whether Scotland could stay in the EU single market when the rest of the UK leaves is a very important thing to look at as an intermediate option. But when you start looking at EFTA or the specifics of the Norway model in the European Economic Area, you certainly realise it's quite complicated. And if Scotland was to stay in the UK, but also asked to join the European Economic Area, for instance, then the first thing it would be told is probably, well, but you're part of a state, you're not a state in your own right. And then you'd have to get into a conversation with the UK. Would the UK either go to the EU to ask for Scotland to be in the single market, or would it go to the European Economic Area and say, well, it's a part of the UK, but could that part of the UK please join?
Well, indeed, there was a mixed reaction from members of the European Economic Area themselves today about whether a deal could be done. Even the First Minister has said it would be difficult. So do you think this is simply about being seen to explore every avenue before going on to press the button for a second independence referendum?
I actually don't think it's about that, or at least I don't think it's only about that. I think although some of the other political parties say it's about that, if you look at the UK as a whole, the Lib Dems are saying that the UK should stay in the single market. So if they think it's a good idea for the UK, if Theresa May doesn't go down that route, and she doesn't look like going down that route, then it's perfectly reasonable for Scotland to say, would it make sense for just part of the UK, us, to stay in, and is there a way to do that? Now, Theresa May has said she wants to negotiate a sort of bespoke deal, some sort of trade deal with Brussels. Could she directly ask, as part of that Scotland should stay in the single market? If the UK started to back the idea, then I think you'd see a different response from countries like Norway or Iceland.
Well, if membership of the European Economic Area was an option, it would provide the softest possible Brexit. But remaining in the single market would come at a price, wouldn't it?
Well, Norway and the other members of the European Economic Area, or even Switzerland, who's just in EFTA, the trade association, they all make a budget contribution to the single market, and it's not quite as much as they might pay if they were members of the European Union, but it's still substantial. In return, they get some payments back. They can be Norway's part of education programs, research programs, and so forth. Obviously, Norway is not in the agricultural or fisheries policy, so it doesn't get any agricultural payments. And so Scotland, if it was in the single market but not in the rest of the EU, would no longer get its agricultural payment.
But there would be very little vote by way of influence in exchange for all that money. We would still have to implement EU single market rules and regulations here, wouldn't we, with little say on what they are?
I think that's right. I mean, again, if you take the Norwegian experience, they do get to go to some meetings in Brussels when legislation's being drawn up to express their concerns, but unlike the EU member states, they don't have a vote, and that's been called a major democratic deficit by Norwegians themselves, looking at the circumstances they're in. But on the other hand, if you're comparing that option to a hard Brexit, where you may lose a lot of access to EU markets, especially services markets like financial services, then it may be a better halfway house, even if the preferable option overall, certainly in my opinion, would be for the UK as a whole to stay in the European Union.
Well, for Scotland somehow to stay in the single market as part of the final Brexit deal, as you said earlier, both the UK government and the EU would have to agree to this. How likely, just looking at everything before us, how likely do you think that is to happen?
I think the politics of it are fairly unlikely. I mean, Theresa May said in her Tory party conference speech that the UK was going to leave as the UK and that there were no opt-outs from Brexit. But of course, we're waiting to see how the politics and legal side of this unfold. You've got the Supreme Court judgment and hearing in December and judgment in January that will say whether Westminster has to have a vote on triggering the now maybe infamous Article 50 that will start the 2-year of exit talks. So at the moment, with Labour saying it won't hold up the triggering of Article 50, it's hard to see SNP MPs, for instance, having much bargaining power. But if Labour shifted its position, and if there was a vote against the government at some point, then maybe you'd suddenly find there was bargaining power and that Theresa May was taking it seriously. So at the moment, the politics look difficult. It's not clear if the EU 27 would be open to it. But I think, again, you don't see where the political dynamics develop to if you don't ask in the first place.
Good to talk to you this evening. Thanks for coming in, Dr. Kirsty Hughes.
Thank you.